Hey everyone, before the episode starts, I just thought that I should remind you that I'm more than likely butchering all of these ancient names and words. Also, the time period of Persia I'm predominantly referring to is the Achaemenid Empire. But to save myself the embarrassment of saying it wrong numerous times and to save your ears, I just defaulted to calling it Persia. Anyways, I hope you enjoy the episode. The Spartan Dionysius is said to have proved himself the best man of all, the same who, as they report, uttered this saying before they engaged in battle with the Medes, being informed by one of the men of Trachis that when the barbarians discharged their arrows, they obscured the light of the sun by the multitude of the arrows. So great was the number of their host, he was not dismayed by this, but making small account of the number of the Medes, he said that their guests from Trachis brought them very good news, for if the Medes obscured the light of the sun, the battle against them would be in the shade. The barbarians being referred to are the Persians, and this quote is talking about the approaching Persian army and the unforgettable Battle of Thermopylae. At the forefront of the Persian army is an elite unit known as the Immortals. Today we'll be talking about these elite fighters, some of the little known details about them, and their role in the Persian military. At the height of the Persian Empire, approximately 480 BC to 520 BC, it's safe to say that the world was Persian. Out of the estimated 112 million people on the planet, roughly 50 million of those lived under the rule of the Achaemenid Empire. That's 44% of the world's population and has even been recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records as being the most expansive empire to ever have existed on the planet. At its pinnacle, the Persians controlled around 3.4 million square miles of land across 3 continents, to include the modern territories of Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Kuwait, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, Libya, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Armenia, Georgia, Afghanistan, China, Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and a few more. This vast expansion occurred predominantly under the rule of Cyrus the Great, Darius the Great, and Darius' son, Xerxes I. All of these kings were effective at employing the Immortals. So, most of what we know about the Immortals comes from the Greek scholar Herodotus and other Greek historians. We don't really have any information from Persian sources to bounce accuracy off of, and because the information comes secondhand from Greeks and other enemies of Persia, the information is a bit limited. For example, we can talk about the name Immortals. The name was coined by Herodotus himself. Many scholars actually believe the name is a mistranslation of the Persian word Anusia, which means companions, with the word Anausa, which translates to undying or immortal. That's just a fun fact because at the end of the day, whether or not it's a mistranslation doesn't really matter anymore, because when I say Persian immortal, you either have an idea or know who I'm talking about. The Immortals were an elite unit in Persia's military force that was always kept at a standing strength of 10,000. No more, no less. The Persians believed in equal opportunity, so while the vast majority of the Immortals were of Persian descent, they did take in soldiers that proved their mettle from various lands that they conquered. Since written accounts are few and far between, we only really know that the training for a prospective immortal started at birth. A newborn would be taken from their families until the age of 5, at which point they would begin their military education. The young boys were trained in various skills including archery, hand-to-hand combat, living off the land, marching long distances, and how to tame a wild horse. These children would then enter into military service when they were 15 years old, and if they lived long enough, they could retire at the age of 50. The image of the Immortals has been distorted by the movie 300. The movie shows these soldiers as wearing dark clothes, silver masks, and dual-wielding swords. While this does make for a very cool aesthetic, it actually isn't close to the kind of equipment the Immortals were outfitted with at all. An immortal soldier in reality was actually armed to the teeth with a variety of weapons. This would include a short sword, a spear, usually 6 feet in length, a quiver of arrows, a bow, and a wicker shield. The loadout would vary slightly between foot soldiers and cavalrymen, but not too much. They wore bronze-scale armor covered by robes and a headdress often called the tiara that reportedly could be used to keep sand or dust from being blown into their faces. They would wear all forms of gold jewelry into battle and would paint their armor and shield with gold so that the 10,000 strong unit would shine in the sun as they approached cities. Another common weapon among the Immortals was a one-handed axe called a sagaris. The head of the sagaris had the typical blade you'd expect on an axe, and the other side came to a point which could pierce through iron and bronze armor. An interesting fact about the Sagaris is that in the Battle of Granicus, the first battle between Persians and Alexander the Great's Macedonians, Alexander was almost killed by it. An immortal cavalryman named Spithridates came into close range of Alexander, and when he struck the great Macedonian in the head with his Sagaris, it pierced through his helmet. A couple more millimeters and the legacy of Alexander the Great would have ended before it even started. Luckily for Alexander, before Spithridates could finish the Macedonian king, he was saved by his fellow soldiers as they shoved a spear through the Immortals' chest. Another interesting weapon that Persian ingenuity developed was the scythed chariot. This was a chariot that had a blade attached to each end of its axle, turning it into an ancient meat grinder. Coming into contact with this deadly machine almost never resulted in a clean cut. Since the blades would be spinning, it would more than likely result in blunt force trauma to a person's legs, causing the bones to break. The blade would then continue to spin and rip its way through whatever was left. Revisiting the spears that would be carried, each spear had a pomegranate-shaped counterweight at the end of the shaft, which made throwing the spear more accurate and could double as a blunt weapon. These pomegranates came in two colors, gold and silver. Gold pomegranates belonged to the top 1,000 immortal officers, while the other 9,000 soldiers had silver pomegranate counterweights. These 1,000 officers were considered the best of the best and would serve as the king's personal guard and would carry spears that were 8 feet long instead of the 6 feet long spears the other immortals were issued. Yes, it's true that Persia's weaponry and armor was inferior to that of the Greek city-states, but what they lacked in quality, they more than made up for in quantity. Refer to the quote at the beginning of this episode where it said that the sheer number of arrows they would shoot will blot out the sun. Because of the Immortals' prestigious rank in the Persian army, they were afforded luxuries that were exclusive to them. They were allowed to have concubines and servants march with them, and were allotted food that was meant only for their consumption, and would be carried in separate carriages pulled by various beasts of burden, typically mules. Even though the Persians were referred to as barbarians in Greek writings, they were actually masters of psychological warfare. The Immortals themselves were used as a way to play these mind games. Should an immortal fall in battle, become seriously wounded or sick, they would immediately be pulled off the battlefield and replaced with the appropriate amount of reserve soldiers in order to keep their standing strength at 10,000. War doesn't always have to be bloody or physical. If you can intimidate another civilization into submission without a drop of blood being spilled, why wouldn't you? The sheer size of the Persian military was often enough to frighten a group of people into subordination. Just to give example of the type of numbers we're talking about, at the Battle of Thermopylae, Herodotus described the scene as 6,100 Greeks, including 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans, in comparison to an impressive 5.2 million Persians. Simonides, a near-contemporary poet, estimated 4 million in Xerxes' army. Modern scholars, however, say these figures were exaggerations, but still consider at least 70,000 to 300,000 in the invading forces. So, even at the low end of the spectrum, the Greeks were outnumbered 11 to 1 in this particular battle. Keep in mind that these numbers are just the soldiers, so when you factor in all of their servants, concubines, and animals, it really isn't surprising why so many ancient civilizations were willing to bend the knee. One interesting example of Persians using their brains before their brawn is when they fought the Egyptians at the Battle of Pelusium. The Persians knew that the Egyptians were faithful to the Egyptian goddess of cats, Bastet. To the Egyptians, any harm done to a cat was considered a great offense to their beloved goddess. So what did the Persians decide to do? Well, they simply drew cats on their shields and let loose a horde of cats onto the battlefield. This was enough to make many Egyptians immediately surrender and refuse to fight, and when all things were said and done, 50,000 Egyptians were slaughtered at only the loss of 7,000 Persians. And if the Persians couldn't prepare for an enemy, then they would simply resort to shock and awe tactics and overwhelm their enemies with wave after wave of soldiers. According to the historians of that time, the Immortals and other Persian soldiers were vain, effeminate, and not very effective when compared to the Greeks. But if that were the case, it's hard to fathom how Persians defeated the Greeks in numerous battles and held on to so much land neighboring the Greek territories. The fact of the matter is that the Immortals, and by extension the Persian military, may have been distorted over time, but it's still obvious to see that in hindsight, they were a force to be reckoned with. You can't conquer almost half of humanity and be weak and ineffective. It just doesn't make sense. And in the center of all those battles and expansion of territory were the Immortals, faithfully serving their king. I hope you enjoyed the episode and learned something new about the Immortals and the ancient Persian military. Don't forget to share this podcast with everyone you know, and I hope you keep listening.